The January wind cut through Chicago's towering skyline, sharp and unforgiving. Sophie Carter pulled her worn-out coat tighter around her body, shielding the small bundle nestled against her chest. Ethan, her 1-year-old son, stirred slightly, his tiny breath warm against her neck. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her words turning into mist in the freezing air. "Mommy's got you." Her phone buzzed for the 3rd time that morning. She didn't have to check the screen to know it was Lena, her babysitter, apologizing once again for being sick. Sophie sighed, torn between frustration and sympathy. It wasn't Lena's fault, but that didn't change the reality she was facing. No daycare would take Ethan on such short notice, and she couldn't afford to miss work, not with rent due in 4 days. As she hurried through the bustling streets, the Harrington Industries building loomed ahead. Its glass facade reflected the steel glow sky, a stark contrast to Sophie's own chaotic reality. For the past 6 months, she had worked as a cleaner in the corporate giant, arriving before dawn to scrub floors and wipe down desks before the executives even stepped into their pristine offices. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than most cleaning jobs, and her supervisor, Angela, was understanding. At least, until now. Sophie's hands trembled as she swiped her employee badge at the service entrance. The weight of Ethan in his carrier seemed to grow heavier with every step. She had packed everything she could think of to keep him quiet. Bottles, diapers, his favorite stuffed elephant. If she could just get through this one shift without being noticed. But deep down, she knew the risk. If anyone found out she had brought her baby to work, especially him, she wouldn't just be in trouble. She'd be fired. And if she lost this job, there would be no second chances. No backup plan. Just an eviction notice and an uncertain future. The executive floor was eerily quiet as Sophie stepped out of the service elevator, pushing her cleaning cart forward with careful precision. The early morning sun streaked through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden hues across the sleek, modern office space. On any other day, she might have paused to admire the breathtaking view of the city, but today, there was no room for distraction. Every step she took was calculated, every breath a silent prayer that Ethan would remain asleep. She moved quickly, wiping down surfaces in the reception area before slipping into the main hallway. So far, so good. The baby nestled against her chest remained still, his warm little breath steady against her collarbone. She just had to get through this one shift. No one would ever have to know. But just as she reached the last stop on her list, Ethan began to stir. Sophie's heart lurched as she instinctively reached for his pacifier, gently pressing it to his lips in an attempt to soothe him. Nathaniel Harrington's office was as imposing as the man himself. Immaculate, modern, and utterly devoid of warmth. The dark leather furniture, the gleaming glass desk, and the minimalist decor screamed power and control. Sophie had heard plenty about him in whispered conversations among employees. A brilliant but ruthless CEO, a man who built empires and crushed competitors without hesitation. Cold, calculating, and entirely intolerant of distractions, especially not the kind that came in the form of a crying baby. She had barely begun wiping down his desk when Ethan shifted again, his tiny fingers clutching at her sweater. A soft whimper escaped his lips. Sophie froze, her heart hammering. "Please, baby, just a few more minutes," she whispered desperately, bouncing slightly on the balls of her feet. But Ethan had other plans. His whimper turned into a fuss, and before she could stop it, a loud, piercing wail echoed through the vast office. Panic surged through Sophie as she scrambled for the bottle, the pacifier, anything to quiet him before the office doors slammed open. What the hell is going on here? The deep, commanding voice sent a jolt of pure fear down her spine. Slowly, Sophie turned, her breath catching as she came face to face with Nathaniel Harrington. He stood in the doorway, towering and unmistakable in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his piercing blue eyes narrowing at the sight before him. His sharp features were etched in irritation as he took in the scene. A trembling cleaner, a screaming baby, and a mess of scattered cleaning supplies at her feet. Sophie's entire future flashed before her eyes. "Mr. Harrington, I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's cold gaze flicked from her to Ethan, his jaw tightening. "Why is there a child in my office?" His tone was sharp as steel, cutting through Ethan's cries like a blade. Sophie clutched her son closer, dread pooling in her stomach. She had broken the rules, she had been caught, and now she was about to lose everything. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears as she tightened her grip on Ethan, her mind scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. I had no choice, she managed, her voice barely steady. My babysitter got sick and I couldn't find anyone else. I know it's against the rules, but I swear he won't be a distraction. I'll work twice as fast, I'll stay late. Please, Mr. Harrington, I just need this job. Her plea hung in the air, but Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable, his sharp blue eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floor. Ethan, oblivious to the weight of the moment, let out another soft whimper, his tiny hands grasping at Sophie's shirt. To her utter shock, instead of snapping at her or ordering security to throw her out, Nathaniel did something completely unexpected. He stepped forward, his gaze shifting from Sophie to the baby in her arms. "May I?" His voice, though still controlled, had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something she couldn't quite place. Sophie hesitated, stunned by the request. This was Nathaniel Harrington, the same man who was rumored to fire employees over minor infractions, the same man whose mere presence sent shivers of intimidation through the entire building. Yet here he was, asking to hold her son? Before she could overthink it, she nodded slowly, carefully transferring Ethan into his arms. Nathaniel cradled the child with surprising ease, his strong hands supporting the baby's small frame. Ethan, still hiccuping from his earlier cries, blinked up at the man holding him, his chubby fingers reaching toward the crisp collar of Nathaniel's suit. Sophie held her breath, expecting her son to protest, to cry again. Instead, to her complete disbelief, Ethan let out a contented sigh and nestled against Nathaniel's chest as if he belonged there. Nathaniel glanced down at the tiny boy, his expression unreadable, but there was something different in his posture, something almost protective. "Rough morning, huh?" he murmured, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Sophie's heart twisted at the sight. It was so strange, so out of character for a man known for his cold efficiency, yet there was an undeniable warmth in the way he instinctively rocked Ethan, as if he had done this before. For a long moment, the office was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Sophie stood frozen, watching as the most feared man in Chicago held her son with a tenderness that made her chest ache. But then, just as quickly as the moment had appeared, it was gone. Nathaniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. His expression shuddered, the warmth vanishing as though it had never existed. Carefully, he handed Ethan back to Sophie, straightening his tie as he stepped away. "You can't bring him into the office again," he said, though his tone was no longer as harsh as before. Sophie's stomach clenched in dread, but before she could stammer out another desperate apology, he continued. "There's a corporate daycare in the building next door. It's usually reserved for executive staff, but I'll make an exception. Starting tomorrow, he'll have a place there." Sophie blinked, certain she had misheard him. I can't afford—" "I'll cover the cost," Nathaniel cut in, his voice firm. "Consider it a company benefit." She stared at him, at the man who had every reason to fire her, but instead had just offered her a lifeline. "Why? Why are you doing this?" she whispered, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. For a moment, he looked like he might not answer. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he said, "Because no one should have to choose between their job and their child." Sophie's breath caught. Before she could say anything, Nathaniel was already turning away, his focus shifting back to the towering stack of files on his desk. The conversation was over. But as she left the office, Ethan still nestled against her, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted between them. Something she didn't quite understand yet. And something told her that Nathaniel Harrington, the man she had feared from the moment she stepped into this building, was not as heartless as the world believed. Sophie hadn't expected to see much of Nathaniel after that morning in his office, but somehow their paths kept crossing. At first it was coincidence, a brief exchange when she picked up Ethan from daycare, a polite nod in the hallway. But then, the moments became more frequent. One evening, she found him crouched beside Ethan at daycare, letting the baby tug at his silk tie with an amused expression. Another time, as she finished cleaning the executive lounge, Nathaniel walked in, looking exhausted, and simply said, "You're avoiding me." She hesitated before answering, "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Harrington." His lips quirked. Nathaniel. At first their interactions were fleeting, a nod in the hallway, a brief acknowledgement when she picked up Ethan from daycare. But then they became something more. Nathaniel started lingering, asking questions about Ethan's day, making quiet observations about Sophie's exhaustion. One evening, as Ethan tugged at his silk tie, Nathaniel chuckled. A sound so unexpected Sophie found herself staring. And then, as they stood by the entrance of the building, his voice broke the silence. "Have dinner with me." Sophie's heart stuttered. She should have said no. Instead, she whispered, "Okay." But the next day, before that dinner could happen, she found herself face to face with Eleanor Harrington. Nathaniel's mother was everything Sophie had imagined. Elegant, composed, and utterly terrifying. Over a carefully prepared cup of tea, Eleanor wasted no time getting to the point. "I know women like you, Miss Carter. You've already gained more than you should have. This job, my son's attention. But let me be clear. It ends here." Sophie's stomach twisted, but she met Eleanor's gaze steadily. "I'm not after anything." Eleanor's smile was sharp. "Then you won't mind walking away." She reached into her handbag, pulling out a checkbook. "Name your price." The insult burned, but Sophie refused to let it show. Setting her cup down, she stood. "I think we're done here." Eleanor's eyes darkened. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Sophie walked away, her hands trembled. She had thought Nathaniel was the biggest danger to her heart. She had been wrong. The real threat had just revealed itself. Sophie barely made it through her shift after the conversation with Eleanor. The woman's words lingered like a poison in her mind, each syllable a reminder that no matter what she did, she would never belong in Nathaniel's world. But she could endure anything, except the possibility of losing Ethan. That fear became real the very next morning. She was halfway through cleaning an office when her phone buzzed with a message from the daycare director, Diane. "Miss Carter, could you come to my office? We need to discuss something urgent." Panic shot through Sophie as she rushed downstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she arrived, she found Diane waiting with two strangers, representatives from Child Protective Services. Her stomach dropped. "Miss Carter," one of the social workers began, her tone carefully neutral, "we received an anonymous report regarding concerns about Ethan's custody and well-being. We just need to clarify a few things." Sophie's mouth went dry. There was only one person who could have done this. Eleanor. For the first time, Sophie wasn't just afraid, she was furious. But she forced herself to stay calm. She answered every question, provided every document they asked for. But then came the one question she had been dreading. "Miss Carter, are you Ethan's biological mother?" The room fell silent. Sophie's hands curled into fists in her lap. This was it, the moment everything could fall apart. She had spent the past year raising Ethan as her own, loving him as if he were hers. But legally, he wasn't. Taking a shaky breath, she told them the truth. Ethan wasn't her son. He was her nephew. Her sister Lucy had been killed in a car accident when Ethan was just a few weeks old. With no father in the picture, Sophie had taken him in without hesitation, vowing to protect him no matter what. But she had never gone through the legal adoption process. She had been too overwhelmed, too afraid that someone would tell her she wasn't enough. Now that fear was staring her in the face. The social workers exchanged glances, making notes on their files. Sophie's chest tightened. What if they took him away? Then, before anyone else could speak, the office door swung open. "I assume you're here about Ethan." Nathaniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge of danger beneath it. He strode into the room with the authority of a man who had never been denied anything in his life, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the social workers. Sophie gaped at him. "Nathaniel, what are you—" "I'm here to clear up any concerns," he cut in smoothly. "Ethan is well cared for. He has everything he needs. And if custody is a concern, then there's a very simple solution." He turned to face her fully, and in that moment, Sophie knew something was about to change forever. "Marry me." The word sent a shockwave through the room. Sophie's breath caught. "What?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "If we're married, no one can question Ethan's stability. It will give you the legal standing you need to adopt him without interference. It protects him, and it protects you." Sophie stared at him, her mind racing. Was this really happening? The social workers shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Harrington, marriage isn't necessary in a case like this." "I disagree," Nathaniel said coolly. "I have the resources to ensure Ethan's security. If he were my legal son, no one, not even my mother, could challenge Sophie's custody." Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. "You can't just propose marriage like it's a business deal." Nathaniel's expression softened. "This isn't a business deal, Sophie." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I should have told you sooner, but He hesitated. "I care about you and Ethan more than I ever thought I could. This isn't just about keeping him safe. It's about choosing both of you." Sophie's throat tightened. She had spent so long convincing herself that Nathaniel was out of reach, that he belonged to a world where she could never fit in. But right now, in this moment, he was choosing her. Tears stung her eyes. She looked down at Ethan, who was happily playing with Nathaniel's cufflink, completely unaware of the storm raging around him. She had vowed to protect this little boy at all costs. And maybe, just maybe, Nathaniel Harrington was part of that promise. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze and whispered, "Yes." Sophie stood in Nathaniel's office, her heart still racing from his unexpected proposal. "You can't just decide we should get married," she said, arms crossed. Nathaniel's gaze was steady. "I'm not deciding for you. I'm asking you to choose. Me, Ethan, us." His voice softened. "I know this is fast, but you and Ethan changed me. I never wanted a family before, but now I can't imagine my life without you." Her chest tightened. Could she really do this? Marry a man she never expected to know beyond passing glances? But then she looked at Ethan, happily playing at Nathaniel's feet, completely safe, and she realized Nathaniel had already become family. Slowly she exhaled. "Okay," she whispered. A flicker of surprise crossed Nathaniel's face before it was replaced with something warmer. And then, before she could think twice, he kissed her. Sophie never imagined herself in a designer wedding gown, but here she was, walking down the aisle of a private penthouse ceremony. The guest list was small, Eleanor Harrington absent, but none of that mattered. Because at the end of the aisle, Nathaniel was waiting. "You look beautiful," he murmured as he took her hands. She smiled. "You're not too bad yourself." The vows were simple, but when Nathaniel kissed her, Sophie knew this was home. Sophie watched from the doorway as Nathaniel gently tucked Ethan into bed. The little boy was already half asleep, one tiny hand curled around Nathaniel's finger. "You're good at that," she whispered. Nathaniel glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "At what?" "Being a dad." His gaze softened. He looked at Ethan, then back at her, and when he spoke, his words left no room for doubt. "Thanks because he's mine." Sophie felt something in her chest finally settle. Yes, he was. And as Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, she realized this wasn't just a marriage. It was love. And it was only just beginning.